Hello and welcome to a millinery trimmings video. My name is Ilona, I'm a milliner based in London, and today we won't be needing this ostrich fan, and in fact we also won't be needing these either, because today we're going to be making some non-bird feather alternatives using Sinamay and silk organza fabric. If you end up making or experimenting with any of the things I demonstrate in today's video, share it with me on Instagram @byilonamillinery. I'd love to see all your creations. Today I'm going to show you two ways to make feathers out of Sinamay and then another way of how to do the same with silk organza. At the end of the video we will discuss some variations that you can try, and we'll also briefly touch on the concept of Uncanny Valley and how I think it applies to these kinds of millinery trims. Let's gather the materials and get started. For a comprehensive list of tools and materials, as well as some suggested suppliers, please see the description box below. Start by cutting some bias strips of Sinamay using kitchen scissors. A reminder that the bias just means a 45-degree diagonal angle to the straight grain. Make sure your strips are about 5 cm wide. Cut the 5 cm strips into 8 cm lengths. Following the grain, cut a V shape at one end of each strip. It's really important to be neat and cut alongside the Sinamay strands and not through them. And now, fray the uncut edge of each piece. You will want to pull out the strands from the right side until you reach the opposite top corner. Then pull out the same amount of strands from the other side. When I arrange them like this, they look like giant space invaders. Then prep the wire. I'm cutting my wire to 15 cm lengths, but this is totally arbitrary, so cut to any length you want. You are going to want to colour your wire to match the Sinamay. I'm using heat set silk paint, which I'm going to mix to the colour of my Sinamay. This was about 3 parts yellow, 1 part cyan and 1 part brown. As these colours are heat set, I waited for them to dry and then ironed them with a dry hot iron in between 2 sheets of baking paper. I'm going to stretch each piece lengthwise top to bottom to elongate it, and then, using a double-threaded needle with a matching thread, I'm going to sew the wire about halfway up my Sinamay feather. Attach it using any stitch you like, but it does need to be secure enough to hold the wire so it doesn't fall off. Once the stitching is done, I'm going to hide the wire between a fold, and to secure that fold I'm going to iron it down with a hot dry iron between sheets of baking paper. And there we go, all done. Some non-bird teardrop or arrowhead feathers. I think they look rather natty. Be sure to stick around to the end of the video to discuss some variations. For the second feather we are going to try to emulate a curled pheasant feather. The tools and materials for this are the same as for the arrow feathers we've just done. First you will want to cut your Sinamay. A reminder here that you want to be using your kitchen scissors, not your good fabric scissors. The Sinamay is essentially hard-dried banana leaf. It will blunt your lovely expensive fabric scissors. As I'm making 2 feathers, I've cut out 2 rectangles of Sinamay on the straight grain, 30 by 10 cm each. I will also need 2 lengths of wire 10 cm longer than my piece of Sinamay, so for me that's 40 cm. I'm using cotton-covered millinery wire that is 0.4 mm wide. However, I recommend you go for something thicker, as my wire was definitely too thin. Although I also tried 1 mm wire which was too thick, so go for somewhere in between 0.5 and 0.9 mm. And now, just as in my previous feather example, I want to colour the wire to match my Sinamay. As I already have some dye mixed up, I'll use that, but you could also use a Sharpie or any other alcohol marker to achieve your desired colour. Please excuse the really dirty baking paper. I like to reuse each piece as much as I can so as to reduce waste. Fold the Sinamay in half. Try to follow the grain when you do this. This will make several steps much easier for you later. Next, I'm going to take a strip of bondaweb about 1 cm wide and wrap my wire with it. If the wire is straight, this should be really easy. Hold the tip of the wire and the end of the bondaweb with your thumb and forefinger and twist the wire. Pull the bondaweb tight as you work your way down. You want to cover the wire to the same length as your Sinamay. For me, that's 30 centimeters. For extra security, I'm now going to stitch the wire to the Sinamay. I'm using a single threaded needle with a matching thread. I'm doing a buttonhole stitch just like in my wiring a hat shape by hand video. I'll link to that in a card at the top right of the screen. But here's a quick reminder of how to do that anyway. Push the needle through from behind. Try to go as close up to the wire as you can. This will make the feather look way more elegant later. As you pull the needle through, leave a loop and hook the needle through that loop and tighten. Essentially, the goal is to tie a knot at every stitch to make sure that your wire isn't going anywhere. Once you've done that, it's time to fuse the bonder web. Flatten the Sinamay out from the wire and then fold it back out to the opposite way to how it was before. This will hide your buttonhole stitch from the previous step. Clever, isn't it? To fuse the bonder web, make sure the iron is set to the dry hot setting, so no steam. Place your Sinamay and wire in between two sheets of baking paper and press the iron over the bonder web. Try to avoid pressing the rest of the Sinamay as that might melt the stiffener in it and fuse it together, but you don't want this to happen as soon we will need to pull out some Sinamay strands. Once again, I know this baking paper is unsightly. We are big fans of the planet here on this channel, so reduce, reuse and recycle as much as you can. Next, I'm going to cut my Sinamay to a feather shape. Here's a helpful diagram. And now it's time to fray and pull the Sinamay strands. I'm using some tweezers and pulling one strand at a time. I found that it's easier to separate out a few strands to the side first and then pull them out one by one. Instead of pulling upwards, I pull outwards. This means there is less chance of breaking and damaging the strands around it. I know this video makes it look quick, but this took me such a long time. But I'm finally done and it's time to shape the feather to make it look like a curled pheasant feather. First, I'm going to give a direction to the frayed edge by pushing down with my thumb and trying to flatten all the strands. Then I'm also going to run my hand down the wire to make sure all the strands are definitely flattened and pointing in the same direction. At this stage it starts to look like a little pine tree branch. I like it, it's quite cute. I might keep this in mind for when it comes to Christmas time for wreath making. To give it the curl, I'm going to shape it round a small jar. You can use anything you have to hand for this, a drinking glass or even a tube from the inside of a wrapping paper roll. The main objective is to make sure that as you shape the curl, the frayed edge is pointing outwards like a spiky spine. If you don't quite manage to keep it there, you can always press it using a hot dry iron and some baking paper to give it that direction later on. I did say at the beginning that I was making two of these, so here's one I made earlier. To make them into the double pheasant curl, I'm going to twist the wire ends together. And it's done. I think it looks pretty similar to the real thing, but we will discuss and evaluate this later at the end of the video. Now that all the Sinamay feathers are done, I wanted to show you the graveyard of Sinamay strands that I pulled out. I'm not going to throw them away. I'm actually going to put them in a little box and save them to make stamens out of for flower making. I'll link to my video about that in the card at the top right. Bonus content time! While I was making the Sinamay feathers, I thought, what else is there that I can fray and achieve a feather-like effect? Organza! So here's another non-bird feather for you. Start by cutting out 2 bias strips of silk organza. Mine are about 17 centimeters long and 7 centimeters wide. Iron them both in half and cut a wire in a matching color to your organza. I made my wire 24 centimeters long, but this is totally up to you depending on whether you want a shorter or longer stem. I'm going to wrap my wire with a strip of bonder web just like in the previous Sinamay feather. The bonder web only needs to cover the length of wire that will be coming into contact with the silk organza, and no further. Then you'll need to fuse the wire in between the two strips of silk organza. Make sure the wire follows the center fold of the fabric. Oh, and I went a little wrong here. You don't need to place the wire right up to the top of the organza. It actually looks better if you leave a bit of space up at the top. Remember to use baking paper to prevent the bonder web sticking to everything as you iron it. Normally I reuse baking paper for this over and over again, but this time my baking paper got a little too mucky and sticky from the previous feather and fused together with the bonder web residue, so I had to replace it for this one. Once fused to one strip, place the second strip on top and iron again. I'm using a hot dry iron. You can fuse it to both fabrics at the same time, but I find that a little fiddly, as it can be difficult to place the wire precisely in the center fold. Then fold the fabric in half around the wire and press gently. Next, cut out a feather shape. If you want to be a little more realistic, a wing feather tends to have a narrow shape towards the tip and is also asymmetrical, so make one side wider than the other. You could stop here and not carry on with the other steps if you want a leaf, but this is supposed to be a feather substitute, so I'm going to continue by fraying the edges. You can do this in two slightly different ways. If you use your nails, you will get a sharper look, with the frayed edges clumping together and almost looking a little spiky. Or you could use the softer cushions of your fingers for a wispier, delicate look which doesn't fray as far. I've done this feather with nails down one side and fingers on the other just to show you the difference. I know it doesn't look too different, but I think if you were to make a lot of these into a feather spray, you would notice the subtleties. Let's talk a little bit about variations and the concept of Uncanny Valley. What is Uncanny Valley? Well, at its core, it's a term used for the unsettled feeling that humans can experience when robots look a little too realistic and alike to humans. But bear with me here, I think this can apply to millinery trimmings too. So here's the problem. You want to trim a hat with something that looks like a feather, but for whatever reason, you don't want to use an actual real feather. That's fine, but at some point you will have to make a decision on how realistic you want your fake feather to be. If you're a super skilled textile artist like Bridget Bailey, which I definitely am not, you can achieve super realistic recreations of elements of nature. Another person who achieves hyper-realistic trims is Svetlana Faulkner with her flowers, and I think that these two women are amazing, and the skill and knowledge required to create such wonders is absolutely incredible. However, personally, in my own work, I find this really visually confusing. Like, is it real? Is it fake? I don't know. And then my brain explodes. For me, if it looks too real, it can actually start to look fake. And that's Uncanny Valley for you. So in conclusion, personally, I think if you make trimmings look a little more abstract, it can actually create a more satisfying visual effect. Because the viewer isn't spending time being confused by the realism in your creation, but is actually admiring it for what it is. Unless, of course, hyperrealism is what you're going for, in which case, go you, that's amazing. And now that Uncanny Valley is out of the way, let's discuss some ideas for abstract variations. Obviously, colour, shape and size, all the usuals, but how about exaggerating the length of these arrowhead feathers? I think that would look pretty interesting. Maybe you could even trim the frayed edges down a little bit, and so they'll end up being a bit shorter. With the curled pheasant, I already mentioned that I think it looks a little bit like a pine tree branch, but that could just be because mine is green. With this one, I think you could try and make the spines shorter or longer, or even maybe cut a zigzag pattern into it, or even a wave. You could also shape the wire into something else. It doesn't have to be a curl. Also, if you skip the folding the Sinamay step, I think you could potentially get an ostrich feather effect if you had long enough outward spikes. I experimented with this, but my spikes clearly aren't long enough, although I think this could still pass as a wing feather. Incidentally, in this example, I used a 1mm wire and it's definitely too thick. Another thing you might want to try with this particular variation is to use 2 layers of Sinamay. I think my single layer looks a little sparse and a little sad. With the organza, you can try a single layer of the fabric, and if you wanted to, you could even iron the edges once you've frayed them. I've done that on this one over here. Alternatively, you could also try the organza on a straight grain. I have no idea if that will work, but maybe it's worth a try. See what you think. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed today's video, please like and subscribe. This really helps me grow and reach a larger audience. See you next time. Bye. But at some point... What is uncanny? Whoops! I knew that was coming. I could feel it, because I've not used any hair clips. This isn't one of mine. Is it where it was?
Oh, you didn't make that one?
No, I didn't make this one. I bought this one.